Welcome to you all. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, and even good night, wherever you are. My name is Nelida Fucaro, and I'm professor of Middle Eastern history at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I'm truly honored to open this year NYU Abu Dhabi's Institute event series. This is a very important year. It marks the 12th anniversary of our Institute public programming. As you might guess, this year we have a unique dispensation, a virtual one, that provides an opportunity to strengthen intellectual and programmatic links across NYU's Global Network University, and very importantly, to strengthen and create new virtual knowledge communities across the globe. So please continue to follow us and be part of our community. We sincerely hope that our diverse lineup of speakers and topics will bring inspiration, much thinking, and this is very important, and vital perspective throughout the year as we continue to face the challenges of the pandemic locally and globally. We are pleased to begin this fall semester with subjects of varied interest, representing cutting-edge research collaboration across the liberal arts, humanities, social sciences, and sciences. We are starting today with an event on OPEC to mark the publication of an important book on the subject, dealing, of course, with the oil industry and international oil politics, topics that have as much resonance today as they did when OPEC was established 60 years ago. Stay with us. This coming Tuesday, we have a lecture on plague and contagion in the pre-Muslim Mediterranean. On Sunday, on immigrant Muslim communities in the US, and next Tuesday, a conversation with the renowned theater director and live artist, Tania Al-Khouri. And this is just a taste of what is coming. Without further ado, I'm now going to introduce Robin Mills, the moderator of today's event, our first event, who will introduce both speaker and panelists. Robin Mills is an expert on Middle East energy strategy and economics, CEO of Qamar Energy, fellow at the Columbia SIPA Center on Global Energy Policy, and importantly, the author of a book which is called The Myth of the Oil Crisis, Overcoming the Challenges of Depletion, Geopolitics, and Global Warming, which was published by Prager in 2008. To you, Robin.
Thank you, Nelida, for the kind introduction, and welcome to everybody this morning, this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I'm very pleased to have an extremely distinguished panel to introduce today for this important topic. We've just passed OPEC's 60th anniversary, and that makes it a great time to look back on the organization's history, its achievements and challenges, and also to give some thought to what comes next for OPEC in these particularly turbulent times. We have, of course, a global pandemic, a collapse in oil prices, global economic shock, and we have the increasing challenge and impact of climate change, new climate policies coming up around the world. So many new challenges for the organization as it enters its next decade. And I think we've got a great panel here today to discuss these issues. Giuliano Garavini, of course, and I've been very pleased to read and to review Giuliano's latest book on OPEC in the 20th century. I'm sure Giuliano will have more to say about his book when I pass over to him in a couple of minutes, but I did think it was a very interesting book and a quite a groundbreaking one in a couple of ways. Firstly, in its use of primary sources from OPEC's archives that were not previously available for understanding its history from its founding up until the mid-1980s, and secondly, in its impact on and emphasis on OPEC as an organization of conservation, not just as an organization in its more familiar role for us as a guider of oil prices and quotas. So Giuliano He teaches international history at Roma University in Rome. And this book on OPEC was not his first. He's previously published on the interconnection between European integration and decolonization, his book After Empires in 2012, and on the oil shock in 1973, oil shock, the 1973 crisis and its economic legacy. And then on the response to that shock, his book in 2018, Counter-Shock, the Oil Counter-Revolution of the 1980s. And those last two books in particular, I think, very much inform his view of and his knowledge of OPEC, which he presents in his latest book. Also on the panel, we've got three other tremendous experts, Dr. Majid Al-Moneef, who will be very familiar to all OPEC watchers, the chairman of the International Advisory Committee of King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, KAPSARC, in Saudi Arabia, a very important, well-known, of course, energy research institution. And before that, he was the Secretary General and member of the Supreme Economic Council of Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia's governor to OPEC. So a person who's seen OPEC very much from the inside. Dr. Bassam Fatouh, the director at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and professor at SOAS University of London. He is specializes in international oil pricing, OPEC pricing, security of Middle Eastern oil supplies and dynamics of oil prices. And he's published a variety of articles on oil and gas topics, another very well-known expert in the field of oil supply and pricing. And finally, Robert Vitalis, who's taught political science at the University of Pennsylvania since 1999, an author as well on oil and on Saudi Arabia, and his most recent book, Oilcraft, The Myths of Scarcity and Security That Haunt US Energy Policy, that looks to be quite an innovative book and a new look at the issues of oil geopolitics, which I personally am very much looking forward to reading. So an excellent panel for us tonight, and I'd like to kick off by inviting Giuliano to introduce his book and talk through some of the issues that he explores in it to do with OPEC. And then after that, we'll proceed to a discussion on some of these issues with the rest of the panel. So Giuliano, floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Robin. Thanks to all of the participants. Thanks, obviously, in particular to Reinhard Falkenberg and Martin Klinke, who were, when I was at NYU Abu Dhabi, the coordinators of the Humanities Research Fellowships. It's an excellent program. I benefited. If you're studying something related to the Arab world and the Gulf. And Alex Sandu in particular was the assistant program manager. And I would also like to thank all the people at the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute who have helped me greatly in one way or the other. This book, the book that we are to a certain extent discussing today, would not have happened without their support. And actually, I'm pretty sad that the presentation of this book was not, we weren't able to do that in Abu Dhabi. It would have been an occasion to meet personally and shake hands with the rest of the people. I just want to mention at the beginning that's also because the NYU Abu Dhabi and the Institute were so important to my research. Some of the primary sources I have used and which Robin has mentioned, maybe the most important for my book, the minutes of OPEC of the OPEC conferences from 1960 to 1986 are now available at the library at NYU Abu Dhabi. So how did an Italian come to be interested in writing a book about the history of OPEC? This needs a short explanation. I think first of all, this is because one particular episode, the oil shock of 1973, is actually considered by most historians a periodizing date, one of those dates that define an era, and in particular the 20th century. Famously, historian Eric Hobsbawm, in one of his most well-known books, The Short 20th Century, wrote that after 1973, the world has lost its bearings, and many people in industrialized countries, in the largest industrialized countries, have a memory of what actually happened during the oil shock. Some have a good memory, things like the introduction of carless Sundays. There was an innovation of 1973. Most, I think, in particular in the US, but not in the US, have a bad memory of what happened in 1973, the gas lines that haunted the 1970s. I think with hindsight, the energy crisis of 1973 was a crucial moment in what now is increasingly being defined as the era of the Anthropocene. So that's an interesting thing, and it was worthy of a deeper look into. But also in particular, Italy itself, the country I'm a citizen of, has a deep connection with OPEC. The head of the Italian national oil company called Eni, Enrico Mattei, the founder of Eni, was actually the one who popularized the name of the enemies of OPEC, which he called the Seven Sisters. These 7 or 8, maybe, Anglo-American oil companies that ruled the global oil market in 1960. And that name stuck. Many people have wrote about the Seven Sisters. Also, the national oil company of Italy, Eni, offered its very services to OPEC at the beginning of 1960, 1961, when OPEC engaged in its first battle against these so-called Seven Sisters on a very technical but important issue, a battle that is described in my book, and it was called over the royalty expensing. I won't go very much into details, but just note that Eni had an important role. I think Italy, in a way, had a connection with OPEC, at least at the beginning of this organization, because it is a peculiar country in between the south and the north of the Mediterranean, half industrialized in its north and half developing, at least in 1960, in the south. It was a member of NATO, but at the same time had the strongest communist party in the West. It had been a colonizing country, but in 1960, when OPEC was created, saw opportunities in taking the sides of the colonized, or the third world, as it was called back then. So while these are reasons why an Italian could be interested in OPEC, I think that I was increasingly intrigued by the fact, and that might be weird to listen to, that OPEC has basically negative connotations in most of the consuming countries, even though OPEC has never really been confrontational with these consuming countries. It is worth remembering, and maybe some of the other speakers will talk about this, that one of the episodes that is frequently linked to OPEC being confrontational, the so-called oil embargo of 1973, really had nothing to do with OPEC. It was something that was related to a component of OPEC, but not with OPEC itself. So these negative connotations triggered my interest. And as I thought of what could be, I knew that OPEC had negative connotations in many parts of the world, but if I had to rationalize what are these negative connotations, I think they are basically 3. The first of these is that OPEC is very much linked to the idea of cartel. And a cartel is something not many people like. I tried yesterday to Google cartel, and the first image on Google Image that you get is the great novel by Don Winslow about the Mexican drugs cartel. If you Google oil cartel, you always get OPEC, and it is often associated to this image of Arab oil sheikhs with their sunglasses driving an expensive car. So while OPEC is frequently associated to this image of the cartel, it is worth noting that when it was born in September 1960, as Robin said, exactly 60 years ago, in Baghdad, far from being a cartel, OPEC was actually born against, it was facing a cartel. It was this cartel or oligopoly of 7 or 8 international oil companies that controlled all the oil that was exported in the world, except from the one exported by the Soviet Union, and could basically decide on the prices of oil and on the quantities of oil that was sold globally through something that is described in my book called the concessions system. So the only way for the local governments to increase taxes on this oligopoly of international oil companies was for the local governments to find some form of agreement. And this agreement with the creation of OPEC brought together countries that had totally different political regimes, which ranged from democracy in Venezuela to the monarchies of Saudi Arabia and Iran, had completely different languages. All the shades of the largest religions in the world were represented: Christianity, Islam. And in fact, OPEC was not an Arab organization. So obviously, oil sheikhs were part of it, but were not the only part of it. And it was the first, I would argue, organization, international organization of the so-called Global South or Third World, because it was born in 1960, 1 year before the creation of another organization of the so-called Third World, the Non-Aligned Movement, which was born in 1961. So the question, the question that intrigued me is, what bound together and still binds together these countries, even in the face of violent political and even military conflicts? One just has to think about the so-called Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the answer is that their governments rule over some of the most productive oil reservoirs in the world. So if you want to study OPEC, this is a way for you to look at the world and geopolitical divisions, not from the perspective of great power politics, not from the perspective of the Cold War, not East-West, not North-South, but from the perspective of natural endowments. I would argue that OPEC is a political alliance based on similarities in endowments in natural resources. And I think that this nature of OPEC as an international alliance makes it interesting as we try to understand increasingly today what happened in the world since the emergence of fossil fuels, first coal, then petroleum, then coal, by the beginning of the 19th century. The second negative connotation of OPEC is the fact that OPEC is frequently associated to rent. Now, rent is once more something that is disliked in most cultures, and I would argue in most religions, because the idea is that you should earn the right to have food on your table through labor, through hard work. While rent is equated with privilege or with undeserved wealth. Furthermore, I would also argue that land rent or ground rent, that is more appropriate probably when talking about oil, has historically been considered crucial to understand by the founders of the political economy of the 19th centuries, economists such as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx. For them, there were 3 key factors of production. There was labor, there was capital, and there was land rent. But suddenly, at the end of the 19th century, land rent or ground rent kind of disappeared from the study of international economics. And in their most recent academic textbooks, basically, you find very little mention of land rent or ground rent. Paul Krugman recently argued, I don't think you can raise nearly enough money to run a modern welfare state by taxing land. It's just not big enough. So it's not an important issue. I don't agree. I think the existence of sovereign countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela, where the management of an international land rent was a crucial political issue and played such a big role in the building of infrastructures and welfare states, is a stark reminder to economists that ground rent, at least international ground rent, still exists in a world split up into sovereign landlords, even though it doesn't get a big space in economics textbooks. And probably my argument is that it should get more interest. Maybe my book could help in that direction. The third negative connotation that is associated to OPEC is obviously the easiest one, is petroleum itself. While oil is still today the most important primary energy source in the world, while much of the industrial metabolism of the world depends on oil, petroleum has a very bad press. And rightly so, because fossil fuels, and petroleum in particular, are the key reason for increasing levels of CO2. And the increasing level of CO2 represents 3/4, so most of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So you could argue that petroleum itself is probably the most important factor leading to global warming, which is a better term than climate change. So today we are witnessing revolutionary times. Up to now, one of the recurring fears was the end of oil, peak oil production. And so, as in the 1970s, the idea was to reduce the demand for oil because the world would soon run out of it. So today, the fear is no and the need to reduce demand for oil is because we need to avoid increasing global warming. So this year, 2020, could be a breakthrough year in the history of fossil fuels. There has been a significant reduction of CO2 emissions and reduction of the demand for petroleum. And maybe this is the first such a significant reduction in demand for petroleum up since 1973. But to my mind, it is far from clear that an approach that is only based on incentives, incentives to buy an electric vehicle or a Tesla, or taxation, the introduction of a carbon tax, will be enough to reduce in the medium and long term significantly and rapidly CO2 emissions and cut them to zero net growth of CO2 emissions by 2020. I think many economists, some politicians are increasingly calling for what is now defined as supply-side climate policies based on quantitative restriction in the use of coal and petroleum and natural gas. And here's where OPEC is interesting. To my mind, but the speakers may correct me, we only have experienced two institutions, governmental institutions, one intrastate and one international, that have aimed at controlling or restricting the production of the petroleum. The first is the Texas Railroad Commissions, which had this role in the United States in the 1930s. Think about Texas alone as one of the largest oil exporters in the world. And the second has been the organization of the petroleum exporting countries at particular times. In fact, as I mentioned, one of the only moments in which global CO2 emissions fell was when OPEC had a greater power at the time of the oil shocks of the 1970s. And if you read through my book, you can see that one of the key reasons for the increase, the quadrupling of oil prices in December 1973 was not the embargo, as many have argued in the past, but the willingness of OPEC elites to, at the same time, boost their economies, and at the same time to cut what was called then the overconsumption of petroleum. In fact, this is actually what happened in the 1970s. There was an improvement in efficiency in the mileage for cars. There was diversification in energy sources, even though not towards renewables. Even Great Britain introduced for the first time in 1973, 1974, the 4 days working week in order to avoid consuming too much energy, which is now being negotiated by the German trade unions in the car sector for different, but not so different reasons. So to sum it all up and leave the floor to the other panelists, while OPEC evokes lofty images for some, such as petroleum, such as cartel, such as rent, a deeper look at it should also reveal that it has played and could maybe, who knows, play in the future also a positive role, and that some of its lessons, such as the preservation of land rent against commercial capital, might be useful for other natural resource exporters in the futures, such as those, think about the countries that provide natural resources to the electric vehicles industry, cobalt in the Congo. So I know that I've now presented many of the positive aspects of OPEC, and I think this is to a certain extent fine, given that this is also the celebration of a birthday, of the 60th anniversary of OPEC. I will now leave the floor open to the most problematic and also some of the more contemporary issues of OPEC to the other speakers. And if there is any time left at the end of the discussions, I will try to engage with them and respond to any of the issues they have on the book on OPEC and that the participants have on it. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Giuliano, for the introduction and the discussion of your book. I think it's very useful, as you say, on this anniversary to remind ourselves that to understand OPEC's possible future and where it might go next, we should first start with understanding its history and bear in mind that OPEC has, as you say, been a transformational organization through its history in various ways and perhaps could be so again, and has had to adjust and adapt to some very turbulent, tumultuous times. And 73, of course, being one of those, but other crises and struggles as well. So I've got a number of different topics I'd like the panel to address. The first one I want to think about is the function which was very much, I think, illuminated in your book through your use of the OPEC minutes. And that's really about OPEC's internal workings. It's a group of sovereign nations. As you said, they are very different. They're different. They're countries from different parts of the world, different levels of petroleum endowment, different economic structures, different political structures, religions, cultures, and so on. So although some of the countries have some commonality, but overall it's quite unique, I'd say, as an organization in its diversity. And yet it has succeeded in generally working together through some very challenging times. So I'd like to ask the panel to think about and discuss for us, how did OPEC decision-making function? And I guess how does it function today? Was this different at different times? How has the OPEC Plus framework more recently affected that? So in introducing Russia and others into the mix in terms of the wider cooperation. And were the different countries, how were the different countries and their representatives making decisions, balancing domestic politics, international politics, and economics? And I'd like to start with Dr. Majid on this and to get your thoughts, and then invite the rest of the panelists to contribute as well.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to congratulate Giuliano and commend the publication of the book, and it's timely, 60th anniversary. But also what's unique about the book is that it takes you a long journey from the beginning, and not only go through just events, but rather it's an analytical history. And within that goes into the history of each member country of OPEC. Iran did this and that. Why? Because such and such was happening during the Shah's regime, and even after that. Why did Saudi Arabia have this position? Because such and such. So it is analytical. You can understand also the socio-economic and political changes that the countries or the members of OPEC have went through. The book how OPEC has functioned, it changed over the years. At least initially, when it was established, it was like a trade union. And it went into some like collective bargaining with the companies to try to get the best, to try to apportion the rents between the oil companies and the governments. And I think in this it was aided by, because most of the nations of OPEC were really new emerging nations. Some of them, like Kuwait, when it joined OPEC, it didn't even have independence. And the UAE, there was no UAE, it was only Abu Dhabi. And even when it joined OPEC, it was like Abu Dhabi, it wasn't UAE. Even the name OPEC, they chose, and I think that was from the lawyer, from Rouhani, Organization of Petroleum Exporting. He did not choose states because he says Kuwait is not a state, so better choose the word countries. And that was like from the background that I gathered from those who participated in the early days. Even the choice of the name took note of the fact that Kuwait is not a state yet. So let's go for the name OPEC, not OPEC, OPES. So that was the first, like a trade union trying to get the, higher share of the rent through collective bargaining with the companies. And the way you portray it was portrayed in the book is really the more or less what we know from the archives of the organization. After that, OPEC moved from this collective bargaining, and then the unity of the members was of importance. The only obstacle at that time was production rationing. Venezuela, throughout the 60s, throughout this, they were calling for production rationing as a tool to pressure the companies to give concessions. And their model was the Texas Railroad Commission, the production rationing of the Texas Railroad Commission. At that time, early on, Saudi Arabia associated itself with the production rationing exercise, but that was just for the first year of OPEC's existence. After that, Saudi Arabia and Iran mainly opposed to, and later on joined by Iraq and so on, any attempt on quote production rationing. And then they opted for a consensus vis-a-vis the companies. After 1973, OPEC took control of production and prices, and it's not a collective bargaining anymore. It's a organization of sovereign states that they either set the price or set the production volume of the it survived at least that first price setting mechanism. The lesson that is learned from that episode is that OPEC, although it controls such and such production or reserves and so on, but it cannot override the market. At the end, they have to play the market. They have to understand the impact of their pricing decisions at that time on demand, on supply, and so on. And that led it to, say, the 1986 price collapse, because it overplayed its cards. It did not take seriously the establishment of the IEA. And that the consumers still have some clout. They can take policies and so on to arrest the growth in oil demand, and that's what happened. So I think at least one of the lessons that could be learned from this, the 1974 until 1986, is that you cannot override the market, that you have to understand the markets, you have to play the market right, you should know what the impact of your decisions on demand, supply, and what other countries, and it's the impact on other countries. They also have their own energy policies to take. So that was the main lesson from that episode. Of course, the lesson from the 60s and 70s is that solidarity and trying to sideline their differences, which was at that time production rationing. That was the main difference. The others could be solved. Then comes the third, which we are still living, that OPEC does not determine prices anymore, but agree on production volumes. That is the ceiling and quotas for countries, and those are sovereign decisions. And here there is a catch, because the decisions of the organizations, especially when it comes to prices in the 70s and early 80s, or ceiling and quotas, the decision is taken unanimously. It has to be agreed by all member countries. So, Saudi Arabia with the 10 million barrels per day is the same as, say, Algeria with 1 million barrels per day. At the end of the day, the quota that member country will have has to be agreed by all member countries. Of course, some countries have at least a stronger bargaining strength than others. But at the end, they all have to agree. Saudi Arabia would have to agree on the production of Indonesia, and Indonesia has to agree to the production of all other member countries, including its own. The thing that, at least the lesson that could be learned from that period is that, yes, production is a sovereign decision, but at the end, the quota and ceiling that has been agreed upon, they are supposed to be for the benefit of all countries, and countries cannot agree on a particular quota and not abide by that particular quota. And the history of the organization is full of episodes and disagreements on, and sometimes even some price declines or something can be attributed to the conformity with the agreed upon quotas. The organization now is faced with the new energy transition. The world is entering into a new energy system, more decarbonized system. So I think the organization should understand or should follow that transition, its speed and its determinants. The organization, or OPEC, or all member countries, had already had the experience of what it means to have a peak oil demand. In April, oil demand declined by something like 30 million. That's a dry run. That's a dry run of what would happen if and when demand peaks and you're going to be faced with a 70 million barrels per day global oil demand, not 100 million barrels per day. And sure enough, the good thing is that the organization actually acted, and acted swiftly. Never in the history of organization or in the history of oil, member countries would come together and agree on a 10 or 12 million barrels per day production cut to respond to that. So understanding that the energy transition will entail in the future, starting with the slower growth in oil demand, if not negative someday. So to prepare the organization, each country has to prepare itself to that eventuality. I don't know whether I answered your question or I took more than my share of the time. So those are my takes from, but I commend the book and I hope that someday it will be translated into Spanish and Arabic and French. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Majid. And I think it's good also that you point forward to the future and the implications for that. I think I'd like to bring in Bassam at this point. And Bassam, you've done a lot of research on oil pricing and the implications of different OPEC policies and particularly the current situation. I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts on how OPEC has functioned in the past and is currently functioning in terms of influencing oil prices and thinking about oil prices and the whole supply-demand framework.
Thank you, Robin. First of all, I would like to thank NYU Abu Dhabi for the kind invitation. I would also like to congratulate Giuliano on his very interesting, very informative and analytical book. I very much enjoyed reading it, and I've learned a lot from it. So thank you, Giuliano. I think a couple of issues really intrigued me in the book, and I will try to answer your question through a combination of historical and more contemporary lens in a way. Let me start by saying that I think one of the successes of OPEC is that for most of its history, its member countries have been able to continue to cooperate despite the huge political differences, political rivalry, and even hot and cold wars between member countries. And we have seen this many, many times. And the book reflects very, very well on some of these episodes with the history of OPEC. And in a way, it was able to set aside political differences and continue to function. This is, of course, not to say that political factors did not shape OPEC decisions. And of course, it will continue to do so. So, for instance, many consider the Gulf crisis in the 1990s was essentially a conflict about oil. And just to give a recent example, the recent exit of Qatar from OPEC following the GCC Qatar diplomatic crisis is also another example. But overall, OPEC continues to function, though one has to say that at times of deteriorating relations between members, it makes it more challenging to reach agreements and implement them. To me, this shows that what unites these countries is a very strong common interest. The fact that their government finances and economies remain highly undiversified, and all member countries rely heavily on oil revenues for their spending. And in addition to that, there's a belief that through cooperation with other producers, they can obtain higher oil revenues than acting individually. And I think this is a very, very strong bind between these countries. In a way, this constitutes a source of strength, but it's also a source of weakness, as expanding the scope of cooperation to other areas remains very limited, even as the challenges mount with the energy transition, as Dr. Majid just mentioned. These member countries have different economic and political structure, foreign policies, strategic alliances, but equally important, their energy sectors are at a different stage of development. Some have very developed energy sectors, while others basically haven't succeeded in developing their sector. So to me, really, if the objective function is narrow, basically how to obtain higher revenues than what could be obtained from competitive markets, in some aspects, the issues become technical, particularly in how best to achieve this objective. And here I see a lot of continuity from the past. Let me mention a few points on this. So in face of a negative shock, every member within OPEC knows that the collective cut is the best response to rebalance the market. I think there is rarely disagreement on this. I think even the US and President Trump understood this principle during the current crisis. There's also rarely a disagreement on the size of the aggregate cut. After all, OPEC Secretariat and individual countries have very skilled people and have access to oil market reports and consultants and are able to determine what is usually needed to balance the market and counteract a negative shock. The challenge has always been how to distribute the collective cut to individual members. And I think that's what Majid alluded to. And choosing a set of criteria such as population, size of reserve, the level of a country's economic development to distribute the collective cut has not been and will not work. Just for instance, take the example of reserves. So a country like Venezuela has massive reserves. And if you are to allocate the quota on the basis of reserves, perhaps Venezuela will get a very, very high production quota. But we know that at the current circumstances, Venezuela, there is no way that it's able to ramp its production or have the capacity to do so. Now, if you look at it from an economic point of view, the low-cost producers should continue to produce and then redistribute. But as we know, such a framework for transfer across member countries does not exist. So anyway, allocation of the quotas will be always subject to negotiations, and countries with higher production and capacity will always have higher negotiating power. So there will be always this feeling of unfairness when it comes to the allocation of the quota. Also in the past and even now, we see some entities, even within the member countries, who resist the idea of quotas altogether. There have been many examples when on NOCs with ambitious plans to expand capacity and attract investment that did not want quotas altogether, and actually have worked to undermine agreements and push their countries to leave OPEC altogether. In the book, PDVSA in the 1990s is an example, but one can find other examples, even from very, very recent events. You know, there are countries where the NOCs want to expand and they really don't like the idea of quotas altogether. And of course, it becomes even more difficult if these countries are trying to attract foreign operators. I think OPEC countries do eventually agree on allocating individual cuts, but this leads to a new set of challenges. And there is the issue of verification. And currently, this is based on secondary sources. But this system has proven its limitations. Only recently, we saw massive divergence between secondary sources on the compliance figures. Also in definition, what constitute crude or condensate, even on the conversion rates, you know, from tons to barrels. And that's why you see basically different different secondary sources reaching very, very different numbers on compliance. But even if you are able to verify that there is non-compliance, how can OPEC enforce? And I think this is a key challenge because, as you know, there is really no formal enforcement mechanism within OPEC. And this is, I think, is the challenge, that in the absence of a formal enforcement mechanism, from time to time, due to lack of compliance or inability to reach agreements, key producers could shift strategy and increase output and pursue market share. Of course, this shift in strategy towards increasing volume does not result in higher overall revenues, as the increase in revenues due to higher output does not compensate for the impact of lower prices. But usually, a change in policy will cause prices to fall to very low levels, giving the incentive for producers to cooperate again. As Majid mentioned, sometimes it takes years to reach an agreement, like we saw in 1997, 1998, or in 2014, 2016. And I think what is one important characteristic of the recent cycle, that it actually took a matter of weeks for producers to get their act together. So these shifts in conduct by producers are needed to keep the group together. And I think this is a very, very key point. You know, the pain from a breakup of the agreement can be much larger than the short-term gains from non-complying. And in a way, that's what keeps the group together. But of course, this process of adjustments could be disruptive and painful for all producers. So rather than treating those episodes of change in conduct as the end of the group, I think actually those are episodes which actually can bring the group together, although this comes, as I mentioned, at a very, very high cost. So I hope this answers your question, Robin, in how the decision-making is that there are a lot of challenges, but there are mechanisms that actually work, and what binds all of these producers is that they all hate low oil price.
Thank you, Bassam. That's I think we can agree they all hate low oil prices, and so do many of us in the industry, however much they're necessary at certain times. I'd now like to bring in Professor Vitalis, and I'd like to just touch here on some of the political aspects. I'd like to get your views on the politics behind OPEC. As Giuliano reminded us at the start, OPEC is widely blamed for the 73 embargo, even though that wasn't a decision taken by OPEC, but it's coloured the general opinion of OPEC ever since. I'd like to get your impressions on how much OPEC has been influenced by international political events, or to what extent that is overblown and members have been pursuing economic interests.
Okay, so first I want to say I'm here under somewhat false pretenses, and I'm also here as someone who has much to learn from the actual experts arrayed to celebrate Giuliano's book. I don't really and I'm a classic professor, which is I've become a classic professor, which is I'm like really disengaged from the real world, the world that you folks are operating in and watching carefully. I am struck by this, into your question. It turns out, I mean, Giuliano is right that from the beginning, OPEC was like kind of scapegoated. But at the same time, in the United States, as I can comment, I think authoritatively on this, in the United States, in the midst of that crisis, most analysts couldn't believe OPEC had any capacity to do anything, right? So the argument was they're really this is really the oil companies and or the Nixon administration orchestrating this crisis for their own interests in a way. One of the only critics of that approach who understood, I think, OPEC's emerging power was Maury Edelman, the oil economist. Now, he didn't like it, but he was one of the folks arguing, you know, all these lefties and progressives and Democratic Party officials blaming the oil companies are wrong. OPEC really does has in some sense pulled one over on the big oil firms, but it took a while for that new understanding to catch on, so that now, 60 years later, every textbook tells a goofy little story that you all know are not true, as Giuliano points out, which is that OPEC did nothing that people imagine it to have done in terms of a so-called oil embargo. And you could test this, and I do in my book. Google the phrase oil embargo or OPEC embargo, and you'll get hundreds of pages talking about OPEC doing all sorts of crazy things. It attacked all the US and other supporters of Israel. It boycotted Japan and West Europe and so forth, when even the OPEC Secretary General himself said this would be a kind of kooky thing for us to do, et cetera. So I'm really struck by how now, 60 years later, we have a caricature of what OPEC is in at least both like the kind of TV pundits, but also academic accounts, right? Year after year, professors write the same thing. I just caught one the other day, and I sent them Giuliano's book to read, which is, you know, they believe OPEC embargoed the West. And then the other thing they think is that OPEC caused the price rises to happen, right? Without understanding what, in fact, OPEC is doing at the time. So I don't know. I mean, we need books like Giuliano's to kind of correct the past history. I think that's what Majid is talking about in a way. But again, I can't tell you anything authoritative about what OPEC is doing at the present moment. But what I enjoy is seeing all the stories that get constructed about it, even at the present time. So I could invite you all, given that you're talking about prices right now, to sort of say, I mean, there's two things that strike me about the present moment. How do we know, once those production agreements are made, that they actually have the impact that we imagine they're having? So, you know, you go to Stanley Reed writing in the New York Times, one day oil prices is high, 10 days later, oil prices are low. There was an agreement. Clearly, the agreement had the impact, and there's no other thing to talk about. And the second thing that it seems to me the pundits do, that I'd like to hear more about, and whether you think it's true, is to always attach political stories to the actions of OPEC pricing production decisions. So if you remember back about, well, when Saudi Arabia was producing full out and seeking market share, the standard story was this was to punish the Russians in some sense. So there's always a kind of political account that newspapers like, and there's always this untested or unexamined belief that the actions actually have the effects that the newspaper analysts want them to have in a way. But it seems to me, listening to all your comments and reading Giuliano's book, that it's not as simple as all that.
Yes, thank you, Professor Vitalis. That is a good corrective for us. And that makes me think a bit about, you mentioned the Saudi-Russia issue, and recently with the price slump, we had this kind of Saudi-Russia-US triangle, all trying to put the blame onto another party. I wonder what the panel thinks about, what is the future of this OPEC Plus framework? It's a radically new kind of framework for OPEC to operate within. So now 3 years old. Is this now an enduring feature of the oil market, or is this OPEC framework a temporary cooperation which is likely to fall apart again? And I'm open to any member of the panel who wants to take that on.
Take this up. I think the OPEC Plus depends essentially on two countries, on Saudi Arabia and Russia. For years, OPEC tried to coordinate with Russia, even when it was the Soviet Union then. But Russia then, we're under the impression that we are a superpower. We're not going to sit with third world countries or with developing countries to coordinate our policies with. So for years, the OPEC and Saudi Arabia, even when we did not have diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, we approached Russia, especially in the 80s, to try to join in, coordinate policies and so on. But now Russia feels, which is a good development from our part, that it is in their own interest to cooperate. And frankly, I think Russia brought in, the Caspian countries like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and other countries. So the OPEC alliance depends on the willingness of Russia, and of course with its other countries, to continue cooperation and coordination, and also on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, long ago, as I said, even from the 80s, we were approaching Russia. Also Mexico and Norway. I was part of so many delegations that went to Norway to try to get their support, and Mexico. The notion is that, yes, OPEC has such and such percentage of world production, but we understood from the 1986 episode of the price collapse in 1986 that without Norway, and at that time UK was a major producer at that time, without a Norway and the UK and Mexico, we will lose markets. So we came to the conclusion that the larger the alliance, the better it is. So to answer your question, the viability of the alliance, the OPEC Plus, depends on these two countries. For Saudi Arabia, from what I heard, I used to be in the room, but I'm not in the room anymore. But it is very genuine, and Saudi Arabia believes that this is our long-stated policies, that the more countries, the better. That OPEC should be an organization for all oil producers. And even I would add, I was even in delegations that had talked to the independent producers of Texas and Louisiana. So we felt that it is important to have a wider alliance of producers. The way it is now from Russia, because actually the alliance, what what happened since 2017 really was of benefit to them. It benefited Russia a lot, and I think it benefited them politically. You know, when prices went below 20, even Trump had to call Putin to do something. So even from a political standpoint, Russia stands to gain, let alone the economic and gains that they had.
Robin, can I come in for a second on that, please?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, just to reemphasize what Dr. Majid said, that it's always been that in the face of a shock, that non-OPEC would look towards OPEC, and then within OPEC, everyone turns to Saudi Arabia to cut and to balance the market. And in a way that that belief, I think, should have been behind us since 1986, because as Dr. Majid mentioned, since 1986, Saudi Arabia has made very clear that it's not going to balance the market on its own. And any action, it has to be a collective action. And all producers, either from both within OPEC or non-OPEC, basically have to participate in balancing the market. And Russia being one of the biggest producers, you know, they had to be brought back into the table. And in a way, I would say, you know, Saudi Arabia succeeded in doing that. But I think, you know, like going back to a world where there are no collective cuts, and basically a world where compliance is not high, I think it's very, very difficult to see, you know, the cohesiveness in the group in this world. So full compliance, collective cuts is quite important. And I think, as Majid mentioned as well, what the current crisis has particularly shown is that the three world's biggest producers, the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, they all realized the importance of of these types of actions in order to arrest the decline in oil price and not to kill the industry, either in the US or outside the US. And I think this is a very, very important realization. I think what is quite interesting in this alliance is when prices start going up, you know, because each one has an interesting point of exit, when basically to exit the alliance, because each one have a different price aspiration, whether they were going to continue to cooperate on the upside. I generally think that they could continue to cooperate even on the upside.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting point. You say cooperating on the upside. I'm just thinking back to the history of OPEC and its kind of different phases, you know, and Giuliano reminded us in the 60s, OPEC was about trying to regain or to gain a fairer share of the rents and get to some more control and visibility over the industry. In the 70s, OPEC was coping with very sharply rising prices, even if it wasn't necessarily causing those prices. In the 80s and 90s, OPEC was managing a situation of severe oversupply. And then in the 2000s, it was again, as you mentioned, kind of managing the upside when prices were high and rising again. So its mission, of course, therefore, has kind of evolved over the years, and you know, and quotas, which we think of as kind of one of the typical features of OPEC, is actually only introduced from the 80s onwards. And I wonder what today, or is it different? Is OPEC today back in the situation of just simply managing oversupply, but now in a bigger group with the OPEC Plus cooperation? Or is OPEC really trying to do something different today from what it has done historically?
I can. Okay, I can say something about this if you. First, OPEC, at least in recent history, let's forget the first area, the 60s and early 70s, and 22, has been more successful in controlling when the market is down. They haven't been successful if the market is in the upward. So they can manage, if there is an oversupply, they can agree on quotas and a new ceiling, that is cut production. But they haven't been successful from the year 2000 2014, when prices were running up to the 100, unsustainable prices. They could not arrest the price increase, but they have been more successful in arresting the price decline throughout history. Never in their recent history able to put brakes on the price increases for different reasons, some of them political. Member countries, there's a public opinion. They say, why should we, if the price is right, if the price is increasing, why should we go out of our way to bring them down? This is always, so it is like public opinion in producing countries, all of them, whether they are oil rich, they have sovereign wealth funds, they have ample reserves, or they are in debt or so, they like higher oil prices. So it is always hard to agree to increase the production, to arrest the increase in the prices. Also, and that was notion that was mentioned, that there are some countries who have more weight in the decision making of the organization. True to a certain extent, but there is always in the history of the organization, countries, they have played a much larger role than their size. Algeria, for example. Algeria was historically, since they joined OPEC in 1970 plus, they have been more, and their production is nothing compared to Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or Kuwait or UAE. They have been because of the political weight of Algeria, being in the 70s, leading the Third World or so. And they were forceful, a lot more forceful than others. The most recent example, which is really strange, the agreement to cut production by some 12 million barrels per day, I guess. Only Mexico stood against Mexico for a production cut of 200,000 or so. They held off. So small countries can impact the decision-making in the organization. And if you add this small country of 200 and that one with 100, you add them all together, they can come up with 10 countries or 5 countries, they can come up to 1 million barrels per day, which makes a whole lot of difference. So although countries with large reserves and large production, they do matters, but also other countries, and the very important example is Algeria. They have been, throughout the history of the organization, a very, very important force, even as important as Saudi Arabia.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Majid, for reminding us of the role of the other countries, some of the smaller producers. I wanted to investigate a bit, what I think is one of Giuliano's key themes in the book, and that is OPEC as a conservation organization. Before, up in the 60s and early 70s, very rapidly rising energy demand globally, concerns about how that would be met, the beginnings of the modern environmental movement. And OPEC, although, as we've said, it wasn't necessarily controlling prices, but nevertheless, prices rose very sharply, and OPEC did end up restricting its production, and so at least reducing the amount of oil use and leading to diversification into gas and nuclear power at that time. Has OPEC functioned as a conservation organization? Was that in any way deliberate? And do the panelists think that it could do so again in relation to the climate challenge in future? And I should just say, Giuliano, you're very much part of the panel, so feel free to jump in too if you want to contribute on that.
Yes, I was just wondering if then we have time to get some questions from the audience. But I'll just say very briefly that I wanted to say two things. One related to the conversation we had before, and the second related to this issue of conservation as OPEC, possibly as a conservationist organization. So on OPEC as a conservationist organization, or if you will, even an environmentalist organization, that was a bit the argument of Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, who was the Venezuelan Minister of Petroleum when OPEC was created, and also was probably one of the, if not the single most important figure for the creation of OPEC. Because when OPEC was created in 1960, people forget this. Venezuela from 1929, to the end of the 1960s was the largest oil exporter in the world. So it was the Saudi Arabia of the times. And Pérez Alfonso explicitly hoped that OPEC could transform itself into an ecological force. So a force that would cooperate, an alliance of producers that would cooperate to preserve a natural resource that was so important, both for the lives of the people living in these countries I call petrostates, and for the industrialized countries. Now, of course, when he died in the 1970s, he was pretty deluded. He thought that objective has not been achieved. But let's not forget that there is a rational idea behind OPEC as a conservationist force. The fact that since the sale and the extraction of petroleum for the countries that exported, it's so important for the political life, for the economic life of these countries, there is an ingrained interest in the citizens of these countries in preserving that natural resource for the next generations. This has been always a debate among the ruling elites and the intellectuals of these petrostates. Frequently, obviously, this conservationist side has lost its battle towards the more developmentalist side, which said the more the better, and we become so that we can become more rapidly an industrialized and a military power. But that was always a debate in petrostates. Think at it from the other side. Has there ever been a debate among the ruling elites of the biggest consuming countries or industrial countries that was not only aimed at asking petrostates to produce more oil and at a lower price? So I say that if you would compare which of the two sides is more interest potentially in natural resource conservation, and in particular petroleum, OPEC countries or the countries of the OECD, I would say paradoxically that OPEC countries have a more ingrained environmental interest when it comes to the preservation of natural resources. The second thing I wanted to say is, generally speaking, related to prices. What drives these changes in price? We have no idea. If one wants to bet on price, we have all read articles that were wrong. The very famous Edelman that Robert Vitalis has mentioned wrote in 1970 that the price of oil would be $2 a barrel for the rest of life, and then just 1 year later, prices skyrocketed. So it's very difficult to say. But I want to say a general issue that relates to price. In order to have a stable price, you need less market. There's no way that a free market will lead to a stable or high price of petroleum. In history, we know that Standard Oil, that was the biggest oil company in the world at the end of the 19th century, owned by David Rockefeller, who became the richest person in the world, paradoxically became rich by killing free markets, by introducing a kind of socialism in the industry of the United States and monopolizing production and transport of petroleum. At the same time, OPEC had a role when the state was strong, when state companies were important as state entities that were controlled by politicians that told them what to do and for what purpose. In a world in which the state has a lesser role, in which state companies are dominated by market mechanisms. So for me, for example, that Majid might say something about this, the idea that you can privatize Aramco, so introduce market-driven mechanisms into that state companies, is an idea that weakens the possibility to stabilize prices, to control the production of petroleum and so on and so forth. So there is a general theme of the boundaries of the state and the market. And OPEC has often been disliked because it represented in some ways the idea that the state needed to have some form of control over the market of petroleum, even only by setting the quantities of oil that is produced. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuliano. And that kind of reminds me of a thought I sometimes have, that it's possible for prices to be low and stable if somebody, whether that's Texas Railroad Commission or OPEC or the Seven Sisters, is willing to hold a lot of spare capacity and deploy it whenever prices look like they're rising. It's very hard to have it the other way around, to have prices to be high and stable, because that situation is inherently out of equilibrium, because it tends to bring in new producers and competing sources of energy and conservation. And so you can have high prices for a while, but that's inevitably an unstable and volatile situation. We've had a few questions from the audience.
Can I just add a point on Giuliano?
Please,
yeah. It's quite important also to emphasize that the fact that those economies of the member countries are highly undiversified, and the fact that they still rely on oil revenues for their spending puts a lot of constraints on their oil policy. So in a way, imagine if all of these countries are highly diversified, then they can decide different type of policy based on fast monetization of reserves. So in a way, it's very, very important to realize that their economies, the structure of their economies, puts a massive constraints on their policy.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. And of course, some of the OPEC countries are more dependent on their oil revenues, and some of them have sovereign wealth savings or lower debt or whatever that enables them to be more resilient than others. So there's a divergence of policies and interests within the organization, and particularly when you bring in the OPEC plus countries as well. So we've had a number of questions from the audience. If you've submitted one, then have already actually been addressed in the conversation. A couple that I wanted to touch on. One is asking, okay, we mentioned earlier Venezuela has enormous reserves. We know that, at least notionally it has probably the biggest reserves in the world, but now a very low level of production, and therefore a very low level of influence within OPEC. Is the influence of OPEC really more to do with production capacity and infrastructure and refining capacity, and potentially access to overseas markets? Is that now more important than just the mere possession of reserves when it comes to OPEC power? perhaps that's one for Dr. Majid or Bassam to comment on.
The question whether countries or say national oil companies should go downstream outside their borders. Is that?
Well, it's just asking, is the real power within OPEC now with those who have the production capacity and the downstream capacity and the access to markets more than those who just have a lot of reserves?
Really, I think Bassam mentioned that it is not reserves. It has never been the case. At a certain time, Iraq had ample reserves, but they couldn't produce it. And Venezuela now, they have the reserves. And not only production, it is if you have the capability of adjusting your production, that is having an excess capacity. So it is not only reserves, it is production potential. And not only production potential, is that the decision, the ability, the willingness to adjust your production accordingly. Some countries have this, others don't. Saudi Arabia probably because of the size of its production and the decision that it took back in 1990. We didn't have that decision before. In 1990, we decided to increase our production capacity beyond our production. We were producing around 8.2, and then we decided to increase it at that time to 10.5. Now it is 12 and so on. So Saudi Arabia took the decision to increase its production capacity, and also implied with this that probably they will live with an excess capacity of something like 2 million barrels per day. That's unproduced. Not very many countries face the same. If also I may, this is related to the question from Giuliano. He asked about Aramco's IPO. This also brings me to the notion. It is the decision of the country to exercise its power over their natural resources. How they do that? There are some countries that not only national companies, they have foreign companies operating in their territories, but there are clauses in the agreements that the decision on production is a decision of the sovereign country. Back in 1973, this so-called embargo, and I'm going to put it aside for now, it wasn't the embargo. At that time, it was all American oil companies who are operating, but the decision of the sovereign state, the government took the decision to cut production, which I think cutting production and not the embargo itself impacted the market more, because at the end of the day, once oil leaves your terminals, they are out there in the high seas. They can go anywhere. What mattered in 1973 is not the embargo against the US, because oil found its way to the US. Even the embargoed oil found its way to the US. But actually what impacted the market was the decision of the producers, including Saudi Arabia, to cut the production by 5% each month, accumulated production, and to reach something like 25% of production cut. That is a sovereign decision. So when it comes to Aramco and Aramco's IPO, the decision on production, irrespective of who's owning, even foreign interest, but now it's only 1.5 privatization, and it is in the Saudi market. It's not outside. In the hydrocarbon law of Saudi Arabia, and even in the concession agreement with Aramco, now the decision on production and production capacity is the sole decision of the sovereign. So even if it was privatized 5% and so on, it's still the law says that. Other countries have the same. Nigeria has something, although they have foreign companies working in Nigeria, but they have a clause that, the sovereign has the right to dictate to the foreign company what the production, and comes to your conservation, whether a country could do that. Thank you.
Robin, we can't hear you.
Yes, thanks, Giuliano. Yeah, so we're just entering the final couple of minutes now, and I'd just like to pose one simple question for Bassam and Giuliano and Professor Vitalis to address. That's just the classic question, which we've got from the audience too. Is OPEC a cartel? Has it been a cartel? Is it one now? And is the oil price really set by supply and demand? So I guess if we can go Bassam, Professor Vitalis, and Giuliano for the final word.
Sorry, you want me to answer that in 1 minute, which could take lectures.
Of course.
But let me as I mentioned, the objective of the group has always been whether to act individually or whether to act collectively. And there's a belief that if the producers act collectively, they are in a position to achieve a better outcome than what a competitive market will offer. So they are able basically to achieve higher revenues than what a competitive market would do. Now, there's been plenty of evidence that basically shows that the OPEC pricing powers tend to change over time. And there are episodes where we have seen a producer change their policy and you come closer to a competitive market. And there are other occasions so that's why it has been very difficult for the empirical evidence basically to show a consistent collusive power from OPEC countries. And I think in a way what this shows is that in a way OPEC shapes the narrative and shapes in some ways, in sometimes the market, but also at the same time, it's very much shaped. Its policies are very much shaped by what happens in the market as well, and supply and demand. And I think I agree with what Majid said, is that, you cannot go over the market and, and at the end of the day, you have also, your decisions have to be shaped what happened in the market as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Bassam. Professor Vitalis?
Well, on the question of what OPEC is as a cartel, I'm deferring to Giuliano's book. I mean, it was one of his main arguments, is that if it operated like a cartel for a short period of time, no longer has the capacity that we expect a cartel to have, though people continue to refer to it that way. He's got another interlocutor, and I'd be interested in what you all have to say about who says now are affected mostly by the financialization of the industry, so that it's speculators, it's bankers, it's the futures market that is a key factor here. And I'm struck by one more thing that we virtually never see in any book about oil prices or our beliefs about oil prices. We never see those prices compared to prices of other primary commodities and their rises and fall. And economists have discovered, and they don't have a good explanation for it yet, that all prices rise and fall simultaneously. So that they track one another very carefully, and yet all our stories are about what the producers are doing at any one time that is shaping their prices up and down. Now, the other producers of other kinds of commodities are not doing any of those things, and yet those prices reflect the prices rise and fall roughly at the same time if you graph them on a curve. So I think that also helps us to kind of reduce the extent to which we want to believe that these sovereign producers are having the impact on the market that sometimes popular media presents it, or populist politicians do, et cetera. But I Giuliano's the expert on this question at the present time. So
sorry, Robin, but let me come here just on Robert's point, because there is some evidence which actually shows, compares the world with OPEC and without OPEC, and particularly with spare capacity and without spare capacity. And the evidence is quite clear that without OPEC spare capacity, we would have seen much higher volatility, and we would have seen much higher spikes and perhaps much sharper downturns. And I think in a way, one should have also give credit, in terms of volatility and some of the price cycles that we have seen as well to those countries who have held spare capacity over time.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great reminder that, yes, we're dealing with big global economic cycles and so on that undoubtedly have a very major effect on all commodities, but also at the same time, OPEC's actions, whether you can call it a cartel or not, but OPEC's actions nevertheless do influence the oil price as well. So I'd like to, give the final word to Giuliano, since his book has been the inspiration for this talk. So over to you, Giuliano.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody who participated today to this conversation. On the cartel issue, I'm not a passionate about the whole debate. I personally think that an organization of sovereign states cannot be defined as a cartel, just because sovereign states, which are the members of OPEC, have interests that are so complex that it's hard to track them down to one or two factors, such as prices, quantities, and so on and so forth. My last word would be on this. What's OPEC's role in the future? Can it determine the price of oil? No, it's pretty clear that OPEC alone, 30% of world production, cannot determine the price of oil. And the challenge we have in the future is that we're dealing with a world that will be less demand for oil. BP has already said it quite clearly. We are heading to peak demand for oil. So there has to be lower production. There will be lower production. So it's a bit the decision not only of OPEC, but also of the largest oil producers in the world that are not OPEC countries to decide if this new world will be a world ruled by instability or be a world ruled by stability. Because this was one of the questions, what can countries that want to use shale oil to extract oil from the Arctic do? They will have to enact laws that ban fracking, that ban the extraction of petroleum in the Arctic. There have to be policies implemented by the largest producers in the world that are not OPEC countries to control the supply side of petroleum, even in the shale industry in the United States. If this will not happen, if you will not have some kind of global cooperation to keep stable prices and global production in a negotiated global level of oil production, you will head into an unstable world in which petrostates will be very, will face troubled times. Some of them we know in Venezuela are already facing troubled times. Will face, sometimes the prices will go to zero, and companies that have invested in renewable energy will have problems. That's not a kind of world, I would like my daughters to live in. So if I have a hope, not to say that, I'm positive that this will happen, is that the example of OPEC will inspire also the other producers in the world to arrive to obtain some form of larger cooperation of petroleum production in a world in which demand for oil will be lower and significantly lower than today. Thank you all once again for being here, even for some on a Sunday, which is a holiday.
Great, thank you, Giuliano. Thanks to all the panelists, and also great appreciation to our audience. I'm sorry if we weren't able to address all your questions, but I think we had a pretty wide-ranging discussion that actually did touch on many of the points that the audience had raised in their questions. Just a reminder that the archive is of the OPEC minutes is lodged at NYU, is available there for scholars to consult, NYU Abu Dhabi. So it's there for scholars who wish to go into some of these issues in more depth. I recommend all of you to read Giuliano's book if you haven't already, and obviously look forward to Professor Vitalis's new book as well. And I guess we're all waiting for Dr. Majid's insider view to come out in print as well, hopefully one day. So thanks very much to the panel and to the audience, and appreciation for your contribution. Goodbye.